a todos, qué bueno que nos podamos seguir encontrando por esta plataforma. Yo soy Dani Mora, quien les acompaña en este proyecto. Hoy vamos a tener la posibilidad de hablar sobre una gran temática para la terapia Gestalt, que es la psicopatología y la teoría de campo, nada más y nada menos que de la mano de Gianni Francesetti, un autor de gran importancia para la terapia Gestalt contemporánea. Y me voy a permitir presentarlo haciendo un muy breve recorrido de su perfil profesional. Gianni Francesetti es un psiquiatra formado en psiquiatría fenomenológica y es terapeuta gestáltico. Es profesor adjunto de la Universidad de Turín en el Departamento de Psicología. Es formador y supervisor internacional. Ha publicado ampliamente sobre psicoterapia y psicopatología, explorando formas originales para comprender el sufrimiento clínico desde un punto de vista fenomenológico y desde la terapia Gestalt. Por supuesto, proponiendo nuevas formas de enmarcar trastornos clínicos concretos. Es presidente de Poiesis, Centro de Terapia Gestalt de Turín y codirector del Instituto Internacional de Terapia Gestalt y Psicopatología. Ha sido presidente de la Asociación Europea de Terapia Gestalt, de la Sociedad Italiana de Terapia Gestalt y de la Federación Italiana de Asociaciones de Psicoterapia, donde preside el Comité de Competencias del Psicoterapeuta. Es miembro del Instituto de Nueva York para la Terapia Gestalt, de la Asociación para el Avance de la Terapia Gestalt, de la Asociación Europea de Psicoterapia y de la Sociedad para la Investigación en Psicoterapia. Él vive y trabaja en Turín, Italia. Es sumamente gratificante y valioso para mí que él nos pueda acompañar en estos espacios que se han pensado con mucho esfuerzo, así que solamente espero puedan disfrutar de este encuentro.
Perfecto.
Bueno, Gianni, para mí es muy importante este momento porque desde hace 3 años te vengo escuchando en muchas clases a través de tus textos y hoy tenerte acá es muy importante para mí. De verdad que agradezco mucho tu presencia y tu estar acá conmigo. Y bueno, dada la dificultad por el tiempo y por el idioma, vamos a generar 4 preguntas muy generales y que tenga la posibilidad de desplegar toda su maestría acá, ¿cierto? Así que gracias, de verdad. Muchísimas gracias. Mi total admiración por usted.
Muchas gracias, Dani. Yo entiendo, no necesito traducción del español. Y si necesito, vado a preguntar. ¿Está bien?
Ok,
Oh, that's
perfecto,
perfect. That's
Perfecto.
perfect.
perfecto.
So if you all agree, we can start with the questions in Spanish, and if they are not clear to you, I will translate those. Okay.
Johnny.
Ok, entonces la primera pregunta general es, ¿por qué necesitamos una perspectiva de campo en la práctica clínica contemporánea, en la práctica clínica de hoy?
Well, it's a bigger question, even though it sounds short. But first of all, I would notice that there is a movement towards a field perspective, not only in Gestalt therapy, that is already embedded in our theory since the beginning, but there is a movement towards field perspective also in psychoanalysis and in different branches in psychoanalysis. So the first observation is that there is an increase of interest on field perspective. So the question would be, yes, what you said, why do we need a field perspective nowadays? It's complex to answer, but I will try to do it shortly. I guess that first of all, because the way of suffering is changing. And this is a very important point that is not so often addressed by the clinical work in psychiatry, in clinical psychology, in psychoanalysis, or in psychotherapy, but there is a dramatic change in the way we suffer during different cultural and societies. As when I say we, I mean Michela Gecele, Andrew Ball, and myself in the Turing School of Psychopathology and in our conceptualization, we try to summarize some different moments in the history of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis in order to make it a bit more clear why a field perspective is more, let's say, needed as a way to conceptualize the therapy. And we usually divide a first moment, that it was the moment when psychoanalysis was born in a Middle European society of where Freud was working, and where the society was very defined and strong and rigid also. At that moment, psychoanalysis helped suffering people to adjust to such a rigid and strong society, because there was not hope to change the society. When Gestalt therapy, so the work of the psychoanalysis was, let's hope that we can help people to adjust to this society. There is the disease of the society, but we can support them to adjust, to help them to know their suffering, to have sublimation, but it was an adjustment to the society. Then when Gestalt therapy was born, the society was completely different. The story would be long, but let's be short and to focus after the Second World War in New York, and after all our founders experienced by flying away from the Nazis. In that moment, there was the hope that the world could change. It was an incredible creative moment in the Western society in New York. It was the possibility that the minorities could have voice. The Black people, the women, students, homosexual could have the right to exist. So there was the faith that if the individual could express their need, the world could have changed. So at that moment, Gestalt therapy focused the intervention of an expressive level. So come back to your senses, feel your need, and from that, if you express it, that will be healing your suffering. So the expression. Of course, after such a moment, the individuals became more centered, more in the foreground. What was mattering was my need, my expression of my need. So narcissism was the next. And so psychotherapy had to change, because the suffering was, okay, I can feel my need, I can express myself, and then I feel alone. I don't know how to stay with you. So that was the moment of the narcissism in society, and therapy, psychoanalysis, Gestalt therapy, and all the modalities as a relational turn during the 80s. So the aim of therapy was not anymore, or not only expression, individual expression, but was connection. So it was important to support people to find the way to stay together, to keep a connection and contact. But nowadays we are in a different situation again. It's not enough the dual connection, because today what we see is a lot of difficulty in maturing, in creating a personality. So today we have the problem of identity. Young people ask to the therapist, who I am? What is my sexual orientation? What is the meaning of being in this world? I don't have so much hope that the world will continue. So what matters for me? So the point is how to mature, how to grow up, how to have a defined personality. And so what we meet, at least in our Western countries, there are cultural differences, of course, but it's a lot of problem of personality. So problem of personality means that the personality is fluid, there is lack of memory, lack of assimilation, a lot of fragmentation. So the point is how to support, and also acceleration. We don't have pause to assimilate the experience. We are always running towards an experiencing. So today I think that the focus is how to support assimilation. That means how to support to integrate in our personality the experiences in order that we can grow up and to find our shape, our identity, I would say. And in this is not enough the intervention, nor the expression, nor the connection, but we need to build a kind of ground that is a shared and common world where I can find my place and my identity. So today, I think that a focus on the field perspective is what we need to reflect and to move towards in psychotherapy, and I would say in clinical work in general, not only in psychotherapy. I'm sorry if I have been so long, but that was my way to be short, unfortunately.
No, I believe that was just a perfect answer.
Y en la actualidad, la Gestalt contemporánea propone llamar a la psicopatología experiencias de sufrimiento, ¿sí? ¿A qué se refiere con eso de las experiencias de sufrimiento?
Well, this also opens a big issue. A big issue that has a lot of historical background because Gestalt therapy went away from psychopathology during the 50s and 60s and 70s because it was too pathologizing. But in the last 25 years, some authors in Gestalt therapy came back to psychopathology, and I am one of them. So our work is to find a way to conceptualize psychopathology in the way that is supportive Gestalt therapy, is not something else. So the first move is to move away from a kind of conception of psychopathology as something that is defectual in the client, something that it doesn't work. Because we can consider psychopathology not as something that belongs to individual, as a label, as a defect. I would say, as you said, it's an experience, it's a quality of experience. So we could ask ourselves, but what is the quality of the experience of psychopathology? And we can even expand more. I mean, psychopathology is not just the experience of the client, but when we meet the client, is the experience of the therapist being in the same landscape of the client. So psychopathology is not anymore something inside the brain of the client, inside the internal psychic dynamic of the client, is not inside the individual. Psychopathology is the expression in the person, in the individual, of something that comes from the field. Somehow is the way the client brings her or his suffering as something that couldn't be integrated. So it's a kind of packaging arriving to the therapist, and the therapist, in the therapy, we open these packages of unprocessed, unintegrated feelings, and the work in therapy is to let them come up and to be integrated. In that the individual experience as a suffering, there is a lot of the individual history, yes, that was not integrated. There is also what is transgenerational that has not been integrated by our parents and families and grandparents. And there is a lot of social and cultural that is not integrated. So in the individual experience of suffering, there is the history and there is the geography also. And there is the individual and the transgenerational, and there is the individual and the society and the society also. So somehow through psychopathology, we find a way to deconstruct what seems individual and to reach the relational and the social.
Ahora bien, usted ha hecho referencia a que la psicopatología es un paisaje y un clima que encontramos en la sala terapéutica, en ese encuentro terapéutico. ¿A qué se refiere con eso?
Well, it's something very basic, but it's something also useful in therapy. This distinction that we make in our conceptualization in our school refers to the fact that there are some elements that are stable in what we meet and some elements that are more transitory. This is like a landscape and the weather. In a desert, the landscape is usually very dry, very hot during the day, maybe cold in the night. It's not often it's raining. If we go, let's say, in the Amazon forest, everything is green. Usually it rains, it's very humid and probably quite warm. So it's something stable. If I go into the desert after 5 years, probably it's more or less the same, and the Amazon forest may be the same. But there are the weathers are more mobile, are more transitory. It can here it can rain, it can be warm, it can be cold, it can be dry, it can be foggy. It depends, and this is changing. In psychopathology, we have some more stable elements like landscapes that are more stable. For instance, I meet my client in a narcissistic landscape, and this is quite stable. There are forces there moving that I meet every time, every session when I meet this client. And where, for instance, to feel the fragility, to legitimate the vulnerability, to legitimate my need of the other, it doesn't happen often. The evaluation, judgment happens more often. And if I am in a different landscape, for instance, in a schizoid landscape, let's say, quite stable is difficult to reach the other. There is a kind of distance or wall between me and the client. This is quite stable. So there are stable elements that are mainly what we call landscape, and there are the personalities that are as part of the landscape where we meet usually. And then we can have different weathers. For instance, the weathers are more the symptomatologies like depression. And as well as rain in the forest Amazon as a kind of meaning and probability, it's very different from rain in the Sahara Desert, where it's very rare and it's like the bless of God if there is rain there. Also in psychopathology, for instance, a depression in a narcissistic landscape is a kind of experience and has a meaning and requires a kind of support that is very different from a depression, the same weather, in a hysterical landscape. That's a different way of appearing, different way of developing, different meaning, and requires different kind of intervention. So we can conceptualize what is happening as finding myself in a landscape with this weather, and to be oriented on which landscape I am and which weather I'm in. It helps to orient the therapy somehow.
Ahora bien, esto me lleva a varias preguntas. Una es, ¿cómo es que el terapeuta y el paciente son utilizados por las dinámicas emergentes del campo para que pueda darse lugar al cambio? Y sobre todo, esta temática alrededor de prestar la carne, que es muy complejo de entender y sobre todo de sentir y vivir desde lo apático, ¿no?
Okay. So, this evening, Danny, you prepared very deep, difficult, and big questions. Well, I start with a metaphor that I often use. There is a comedy by Luigi Pirandello, who was an Italian author, who wrote this comedy that is a piece of theater, actually. 6 characters seeking for an author. And he started the comedy by saying, I wrote this comedy in order to get rid of a nightmare. And what was the nightmare? The nightmare was that he one day arrived at home and there were 6 characters asking him to write their story. And he said, no, I don't run story that I don't understand the meaning, so get away from my home. But the day after, they were there again, and the day after again, and again, until Pirandello says, I started to understand the meaning of their stories, and I wrote their stories, and they didn't come anymore in my home. And this is the comedy. Their story is the comedy that now you will see in the theater. It's a good metaphor because in a field perspective, as I understand it, and it seems quite crazy, but at the end it's not. When I am with my client, there is a kind of field dynamic in the room, and there are characters seeking for an author to exist. These characters are, we can call them proto-feelings. That means feelings, emotion, affective impression that are not still processed enough or formulated enough to be perceived, to be seen, to be experienced, and so to be processed. As if there is something moving in the room that is looking to exist. And this is part of the psychopathology, by the way, because psychopathology insists, and the symptomatology comes and again, like the characters of Pirandello, until we don't find the meaning and we leave them existing. These proto-feelings are arriving from what has not been integrated in the story of the client, in the story of the therapist, in the society where they live. So it's what is put aside. Somehow we could say it's dissociated from the personality. And where these characters can take shape, can arrive to exist, usually in the flesh of the therapist more than in the flesh of the client. Why? Because the client is arriving because he cannot integrate these feelings. So the one who is there, who often has more support than the client, that can be available to be taken by this feeling, is the therapist. So I use this way that I took from a French philosopher, Jean-Luc Marion, of saying that the therapist lends his or her flesh to the field forces in order to let what is dissociated to emerge. I give a little example, if it's okay for you, in order to be less abstract. In a group, there was a person telling terrible histories of her experience in war, and she was telling this traumatic experience by smiling, almost laughing. If I look to this phenomenon, I could say, okay, there is something dissociated because there is not the pain of the war. So in a mono-personal, individualistic way of intervening, I could say to this client, I see that you are smiling while you are telling terrible history. Maybe you are not aware of it. So it's an intervention in order to increase the awareness. If I look the same situation in a more bipersonal, let's say, way, I would ask myself how I, as a therapist or something happening in the group, is, let's say, not supporting the pain of this client to emerge. So I could make an intervention like, I see that you are smiling when you say terrible things. maybe there is something that I'm doing that is not supporting you in feeling the pain. This could be a bi-personal intervention. There is another way that is more the field perspective and landing the flesh. It's just a little example of that. That it could be that I see this gap between the story and the expression, and I could notice that I feel a pain in my chest when she's saying that. So I could tell her, listen, I see that when you are telling these terrible stories with smile, I feel a pain in my chest. And then maybe when I say this, I could feel a kind of sadness and pain. And I could say, and when I say this, I really feel a pain and a big sadness emerging in myself. And you see, it's another kind of intervention. I land in my flesh to something that cannot be felt by the participant, and it emerges through me. This is an example of, let's say, land in the flesh. It's simple, it's didactical, but the idea is that often we are taken by these forces, we are landing this flesh by something that is unpleasant, that we feel out of place, that we wouldn't feel. We feel that we are not good enough therapists in feeling that, but everything we feel as a therapist is very precious because it's the way we are antenna of the field forces. And those points are the doors for letting the change entering in the process. The change is already there, knocking at the door. This is the way we think today.
That's impressive.
Now it's up to you.
Esto se vincula mucho con la última parte de tu pregunta, Dani, en la que dices, es necesario un sufrimiento compartido.
Ese es el gran tema, ¿no? El sufrimiento compartido, sobre todo porque hay algo muy complejo para el terapeuta y es acoger todas las resonancias perturbadoras, lo que siempre se habla que es el tercer invitado en la sesión, ¿cierto? Que es lo aterrador, lo complejo, lo difícil. Entonces, ¿cómo se puede acoger lo incómodo y para qué dar lugar a eso no familiar?
Mm-hmm. Well, Danny, you are right. First of all, it's easy to say, not easy to do. The bad news is that therapists are anyway taken by the field forces. The difference is we are aware or not aware. We are using or not using them. So I would say that the less we are aware of being taken by the suffering, but what is trying to emerge, the less we are aware, the more we are, let's say, under the danger of burning out in our work. Because we are anyway accumulating, we are contaminated by that. And if we are not aware, this will impact our lives. We don't have to forget that for instance, the psychiatrists are the profession most in danger of suicidal risk, alcoholism, addictions, and many other things. And I think it's not by chance, because as psychiatrists, we are very exposed and we don't have much support for processing what we are exposed to. So we are continuously contaminated. So this happens anyway. So field perspective, I think, help us to be aware and to welcome, as you said, what is unpleasant, out of place, weird, eerie, strange, that make us in a situation of impotence. So all these feelings are daily experience of therapists, to feel not good enough, not knowing enough, impotence. But this is not by chance. This is not because we are not good enough. This is because what was excluded with this element of being not welcome, of putting the client in a situation of impotence. So when it comes, impotence, being not welcome, being a kind of alien, unfamiliar, is part of the process of emerging of what was dissociated. If I was kept aside my house for years and years and years, when I come in, I will be the stranger. Enter. And how to tolerate this is an important point. How we tolerate to enter in such a field dynamic and to let be taken by it. I guess that there are many possible support. One is, of course, our individual therapy. It's very important to be aware of us, to have a good connection with supervision, and our therapy is another important point. Also, for me, also to have experience and knowledge in clinical practice is important in order to know in which landscape I am. If I arrive in my shorts and then I find myself in the Pole North, this North Pole, this could be quite uncomfortable. If I know I am more prepared somehow. And I guess also to have an awareness of how we process what is happening with our client, how I feel after the session, how tired I am. So what remains with me, that awareness is very important. And I think that another support is to have a good enough life. A good enough life. Yes.
Ahora,
Sorry, what do you mean by a good enough life? I'm interested in knowing that.
Yeah, I mean to have a good enough situation of relationship, of mutual support, to have some love in our life. You know, that's some basic human issues.
Okay.
doctor Gianni, y hay algo importante allí, ya haciendo énfasis en lo clínico. La primera parte es que la ausencia se haga presente, ¿cierto? Aparece lo extraño, lo no familiar. Una vez que podemos acoger eso, ¿qué sigue en el proceso terapéutico? Porque ahí apenas es que empieza a desplegarse un algo. ¿Ahí qué viene?
Well, usually the most difficult part is to open the door and to let what was kept out, to let it be, to let it exist, and not to discard it, or not to be too afraid of it, or not to feel that it's us, that we are not good enough. So to tolerate it is very important. And then what is difficult, paradoxically, it could be named as it's difficult not to do nothing at that point. It's as if I become a kind of support for letting this feeling, this theme appearing and to enter in the process. There is not much to do at that point. It seems strange because in therapy we are always asking ourselves what to do in order to make him feel better, what to do. And also in supervision, the request is what I have to do with this client that I'm in impasse. But the what to do is the point where the way is blocked. It's not there that we can find a way. The way is more in supervision. Often the direction is what I'm not able to feel, what I'm not able to let it be in this situation with this client. I have a little example, maybe it can be useful, but some months ago, the colleague working with in the same office that I work came out from after a session. It was a first session with a new client, a woman, and she looked at me and she said, shit, very bad session, so heavy, so tiring. When I sat down with this client, I immediately felt that my clothes were not good enough, my hair were not good enough, I was not a good enough therapist. Shit. And what a narcissistic person is this one. It's interesting because the therapist felt de-evaluated, and so she felt bad because there was a devaluation arriving. Then when she came out in the corridor, she said that the client was a horrible narcissistic, so she de-evaluated the client. And when she told that to me, I thought, you are a very good experienced therapist, and you are not good enough, you are not capable to understand that it's a narcissistic process. So I de-evaluated the therapist. You see, the point is not that the client, the therapist, or me are good enough to, or have enough good value. The point is that the de-evaluation is the characters that has to emerge in order to exist. And this becomes not so personal of me, of her, of the client. It's just that there is these characters seeking for an author that must appear. When it appears, the point is that the point as a therapist is not to act that theme, but to let it be. There is a de-evaluation in the room. I feel it. I can look at it with compassion. I don't have to take this ball and to put this ball on the shoulder of the client, or just to keep it to me. It's just there. The de-evaluation needs to appear, and this will change the ground of my intervention, because I could become more compassionate, for instance. That is already a change in the process. This is just an example.
Pues, Gianni, hay algo muy discutido en la psicopatología y quiero saber su percepción acerca de esto, y sé que ya estamos a punto de cerrar, ¿no? Que es las modalidades de contacto. Hay unos autores que los ven como interrupciones y hay otros que son modalidades. ¿Sí? ¿Usted cómo ve estas llamadas interrupciones? ¿Son interrupciones o no?
Well, it depends what you define as contact, because if we define contact as something that is part of our continuous life, I guess that interruption is not the right word, because contact is never interrupted. So, but this is a matter of what it matters for me about the contact interruption or contact deflection, or whatever you want to call it, is the way we use this in different perspectives. Because in a monopersonal perspective, I would say this client is interrupting the contact by retroflecting. So I have to do an intervention in order to support him not to retroflect. In a bipersonal perspective, I would say, oh, the client is retroflecting. What I'm doing, because he's retroflecting. So let's do something in order that it doesn't have the need to retroflect. In a field perspective, if there is a retroflection appearing, you see that I'm not saying the client is retroflecting. I say the retroflection is appearing. That is not something that I want to solve. For me, the retroflection is the door from where the changes needs to enter. So I adjust myself in a way to let the retroflection be. And by adjusting that, I change the field, and what is knocking the door through retroflection can enter. Because all the interruption of contact, if we want to call it that, are avoiding strategies in order not to feel something that is there. So I don't want to solve it. I want to stay with that and to let the stranger knocking and not entering, because there is the retroflection that could enter. It's a way of considering it.
Bien, doctor Gianni, de verdad que para mí es un honor compartir este espacio con usted. Gracias, Jhonny, por acompañarnos, por ser un soporte importante en este espacio. Y estoy seguro nos vamos a seguir encontrando, porque sí o sí, en algún momento lo encontraré para que me firme todos estos libros,
Fantástico,
todos.
fantástico, fantástico.
Todos, así
Gracias,
que
Dani, por tu atención, veramente. Gracias.
no, para mí, como le digo, es un honor. Así que un gran abrazo, cuídese mucho y en algún momento nos
Muchas gracias.
encontraremos en frente.
Muchas gracias, Danny, y muchas gracias, Jhonny. You were wonderful in summarizing. So the next time you will do the conference, and I will give the instruction to you.
That would be great. Why not? Muchísimas gracias. Thank you both.
Hasta luego.
Muchas gracias. Buenas
Chao.
noches. Chao, chao.